When a certain demographic can't understand something, the conclusions they reach are off the chart. Welcome to World of Batshit. Over the 4 centuries since its invention, telescopes and their designs have been refined into ever more capable and precise instruments. It is possible to examine the universe around us in every waveband, from Earth and from space. Telescopes are like most things, you get what you pay for. But decent kit is available even to amateur astronomers, with some making discoveries that are then notified to the professional community. However, for even the casual observer, it's not difficult to ascertain the shapes of the Moon and the planets. You don't need any optical assistance to figure out the shape of the Moon, but if you were in any doubt, a pair of binoculars will seal the deal, as well as allowing you to see more detail. Imagine my surprise then when I found that there are skid marks out there who think that there are no spheroidal objects in space. A YouTube conspiratard thinks he's blown the lid on the whole thing by the tried and tested method of dicking around on the internet. Here he is. Named after himself, he has a channel named Jeranism. He's a flat earther and conspiracy nut. Naturally, he thinks he's sticking it to the man, who of course lives at NASA. So let's find out why he thinks there are no spheroidal objects in space, no planets, and that parallax does not occur. Before we do, I should point out that he doesn't like being called Jeranism. As we'll come to see, his pickiness with regard to pronunciation is something of a double standard, but in this video I will do my best to avoid calling him Jeranism. Let's get cracking. Jism begins his video by providing an overview of Tycho Brahe, taken from the Wikipedia page. I have no particular contention with these statements or with the use of Wikipedia here, as it can be a useful starting point for research. It should be noted, however, that Jism doesn't actually say that he got this material from Wikipedia.
Many actually think he was murdered by Johannes Kepler.
It's Johannes, and unfortunately for Jism, appealing to an unquantified and unspecified many is irrelevant in establishing the facts of the matter. He claims his suggestion of murder will probably make more sense once you've heard his attempt to concoct a motive through the application of more quote mining. So grab your pick and your face-protecting oven glove as we follow his train of thought into the mines of idiocy. And by train of thought, I do of course mean clapped-out old minecart with wonky wheels, squeaky bearings, and a substantial crust of pit mule feces.
It will probably make more sense after this quote from Tycho Brahe.
There really aren't any spheres in the heavens.
This next quote, attributed to Brahe, is, as we'll see, something of a composite. The book, The Grip of Gravity, by Gondolacker and published by Cambridge University Press, contains the first sentence. It also supplies the context, which Jism appears to have conveniently omitted to present to his viewers, and which I will now supply. Tycho made accurate measurements of the positions of this comet, being the Great Comet of 1577, and he combined these with measurements made by other astronomers in Europe to show that the parallax of the comet was very small. This led him to conclude that the comet was more distant than the Moon. Comets had hitherto been considered to be part of the earthly sublunar world. Tycho's observations conclusively demolished this notion. It's worth noting at this point that Jism's video is titled Tycho Brahe says no spheres, no parallax, no planets, and yet here we have an account of Brahe working out the distance to a comet using parallax. Well, let's read on and see if the stench of failure gets any stronger. Tycho also showed that the comet was moving on an elliptical path and not a circle, the path that the celestial bodies were expected, almost required, to follow. Tycho published his findings in 1588 and concluded there are not really any spheres in the heavens. Brahe's statement refers to the belief at the time that objects in the sky circled Earth in a series of rotating or crystalline spheres. By finding that the comet moved in an elliptical path, he showed that this couldn't be the case. James Burke, in his book The Day the Universe Changed, accompanying the 1985 TV series of the same name, adds Brahe's own qualifying words on the matter. There are not really any spheres in the heavens. It seems futile to undertake this labour of trying to find a real sphere to which the comet may be attached. Comets cannot by any means be proved to be drawn around by any spheres. It should be clear that Brahe was saying that the old belief of crystalline spheres had to be horseshit, not that there were no spherical objects in the sky. When we consider the second part of Jism's quotation, which he appears to have fished from any of a number of quotation websites, it's pretty clear again that the spheres to which Brahe refers are the crystalline ones devised by experts to save the appearances, which really did exist only in their imaginations, for the purpose of enabling the mind to conceive what was thought to be perfectly circular motion of celestial objects. Only a complete idiot would bolt these two quotes together and claim that Brahe was referring to the shapes of the celestial objects themselves, such as planets. As we've established through a literal, childish reading of the great man's words, and by not even attempting to ascertain context, that is exactly what Jeraneurysm thinks he was saying. Having quoted from the first and third paragraphs of the Wikipedia page on Brahe, how could he possibly have missed the second paragraph, which clearly refers to Brahe's work unequivocally disproving the notion of immutable rotating spheres that embedded and carried celestial objects? Brahe's conclusion about there being no crystalline spheres carrying objects in circular orbits was correct. Jism's abuse of his no spheres quote was total bollocks.
Tycho also said that there was no stellar parallax. So what's that mean? Well, it means stars are not distant.
It means exactly the opposite. Move your head from side to side and you can clearly see that the parallax angle subtended by distant objects is smaller than nearby ones, and that the further away something is, the harder it becomes to perceive. Unsurprisingly, when things are very far away, the parallax angle becomes smaller than the angular resolution of your eye, making it impossible to discern.
It means stars are not distant. And their distance involves the distance to the sun, and that's wrong too.
Even Brahe worked with a value of 1,210 Earth radii, placing the Sun some 8 million kilometers away, rather at odds with the hilarious beliefs of flat Earth idiots like Jism, who think it's only a few thousand miles away. Kepler, however, realised that were the Sun as close as 8 million kilometers, Brahe should have been able to detect parallax of Mars, but he couldn't. It fell to Edmund Halley to devise a method using transits of Venus. Having missed the opportunity of the transits of 1631 and 1639, Halley prepared a detailed method for use for the next transits in 1761 and 1769, long after his death. This resulted in the most accurate figure available at the time, 153 million plus or minus 1 million kilometers. This is being progressively refined as measurements and equipment have improved. From the train wreck of his attempt to understand Brahe's work in any conceivable way, Jism thinks he's built a case for murder. What could possibly go right?
Right after Tycho died under strange circumstances. Some say possibly mercury poisoning, but in 2012 they exhumed his body, and scientists tested and found mercury, but said it wasn't enough to be lethal.
Here we see Jism's failure to read the Wikipedia article he previously quote-mined. Brahe's body was exhumed for the first time in 1901. Samples of hair from his moustache taken at the time were tested in the early 1990s, and it is those tests that indicated high levels of mercury. The suggestion of poisoning was merely speculation, because nobody knew how it got there, and such speculation somewhat ignored Brahe having been an alchemist. The body was exhumed again in November 2010, with samples of hair, bone and clothing being collected. And here we get to Jism's selective reading again. The team reported in November 2012, 2 years after the exhumation, that there was not enough mercury to substantiate murder, and that there were no lethal levels of any poisons present, concluding that it is impossible that Tycho Brahe could have been murdered. It certainly doesn't fit with accounts of his death in any case. Science being science, the findings were confirmed by the University of Rostock. However, none of this was good enough for Jism.
But there was some mercury. I wonder if science had an agenda. Did they know the half-life was 27 years?
In human brains, you fucking moron, not outer scales of beard hairs. Had he actually bothered to advance his thought any further than assuming that mercury magically disappears post-mortem, he might have got as far as making this important distinction. From a toxicological standpoint, the elimination half-life refers to the time taken for half of a substance to be, well, eliminated from the body by its various processes. And sure enough, when we read Rooney's 2014 paper, we find that he was interested in establishing the elimination half-life of mercury in the brain. You'll be unsurprised to hear that biological processes can't eliminate a substance such as a xenobiotic when the organism is dead. Consequently, it is impossible for Rooney's work to prop up Jism's delusion of lethal levels of mercury conveniently vanishing over 4 centuries. It also provides no explanation with regard to the behaviour of mercury on the outer scales of beard hair. An alternative means by which mercury levels could decrease post-mortem could be by radioactive decay. However, no isotope of mercury has a half-life of 27 years, and the subject of Rooney's paper clearly isn't radioactive decay. Jism, of course, didn't bother to read his paper and can't be trusted to extract the salient points even if he did. If Jism is claiming that Brahe were poisoned with radioactive mercury, particularly involving a non-existent isotope, his fictitious poisoner would have had to have isolated enough radioactive mercury to ensure that only trace amounts of stable isotopes were left when someone decided to check centuries later to keep the murder conspiracy going. This, of course, would have been rather difficult in 1601 when Brahe died, because radioactivity wouldn't be discovered until 1896.
Even Wikipedia says that the first exposure levels are high, but quickly begin to decrease.
In living organisms, a substance can only be eliminated from the body by biological processes when the body is alive. Why is it even necessary to explain this? Jism then has not only failed to provide a case for the phenomenally prescient poisoner, but he has also failed to provide any explanation as to why the work undertaken in examining Brahe's remains was flawed or invalid. Instead, he reverts to the typical form of conspiracy nuts, and simply declares that such measurements can't be undertaken. Having concluded that Brahe was murdered, despite a total lack of evidence and through the salacious use of cherry-picking his way around relevant facts, Jism concludes that it was because Brahe knew something.
Of course!
Where does Jism go to find evidence of this global conspiracy of science? Why, he's pushing his mule-shit-covered minecart back in the direction of Wikipedia, of course. This time it's the page on the Teutonic system.
Well, in writing to Christoph Rothman, a Copernican astronomer, Tycho used basic geometry to show that, assuming a small parallax that just escaped detection, the distance to the stars in the Copernican system would have to be 700 times greater than the distance from the Sun to Saturn. Moreover, the only way that the stars could be so distant and still appear the sizes they do in the sky would be if even average stars were gigantic, at least as big as the orbit of the Earth, and of course vastly larger than the Sun. And Tycho said the more prominent stars would have to be even larger still. And what if the parallax was even smaller than anyone thought? So the stars were going to be more distant. Then they would have to all be even larger still.
Brahe's conclusion, however, was flawed, as we saw in Testing Geocentrism Part 10. Brahe also thought that stars were about 1 arc-minute in size. What he didn't know is that 1 arc-minute is a typical resolution of the human eye. Any point light source would never appear smaller than that to him, only dimmer. Like other astronomers of the time, Brahe was unaware that stars vary in their luminosity, and so, based on the assumption that dimmer stars must be further away, he concluded that the dimmer and apparently more distant stars would have to be physically larger in order to appear about the same size to the eye. It's a sensible progression of thinking based on the information he had available. But a quick look at the sky with magnification shows it's wrong, as stars invisible to the naked eye are made visible.
And what do we have today? That exact system, not because it's true, but because that's what it needs to be to keep the sun in the middle.
No, we don't have that system at all. Stars may be smaller or larger than the sun, more or less luminous. In the real world, the apparent brightness of a star is a function of its actual luminosity and its distance. Nobody in the last 4 centuries has claimed that stars that are further away must be physically larger just to keep up appearances, and no astronomy text says anything of the sort. Jism is simply a liar.
So, what exactly is parallax?
Oh, I know, me! Okay, fine.
The easiest way to describe it would be to think about sitting in the passenger seat of a car and looking over at the speedometer. It would look different as far as miles per hour than the driver sees. That's technically parallax.
Oddly, he does go on to read a reasonable description. However, it is accompanied by irrelevant imagery of stars rotating around an axis that has absolutely bugger all to do with parallax. We'll find out why shortly. In the meantime, 500 points will be deducted from Flattard door.
Down lower we see here the first successful measurements of stellar parallax were made by Frederick Bessel in 1838 for the star 61 Cygni.
No, it's Friedrich Bessel, and the star is 61 Cygni, as in the letter G comes before the letter N. Cygni, as in it's a star of the constellation Cygnus, as in Cygnus the Swan.
Accurate calculations of distance based on stellar parallax require a measurement of the distance from Earth to the Sun, now based on radar reflection off the surfaces of planets. Guys, it's all nonsense.
Unfortunately, JISM doesn't provide any explanation as to why measuring distances to planets using radar is impossible, which is a happy coincidence because it is possible. He also doesn't explain why the distance to the Sun can be accurately determined without using radar at all.
The star with the largest parallax is Proxima Centauri, has a parallax of 0.7687 plus or minus 3/1000ths of an arcsecond. This angle is approximately that subtended by an object 2 centimeters in diameter located 5.3 kilometers away. Let's put that into a little easier to understand numbers. 0.76 is 76 hundredths of a second of arc, which represents about 1/5000th of a degree. Okay, now look at this. We are talking about 2 centimeters over 5.3 kilometers or 3.3 miles.
It's probably best not to ask what this diagram is attempting to represent. It probably means something to Jeranism, in the same way that this looks like a photorealistic rendering of Mummy to a 4-year-old.
Think of somebody standing across from you, 3.5 miles or 5.3 kilometers, and think of having to measure at 2 different points in time if something across from you 3.3 miles moved 2 centimeters.
Yes, it would be difficult, which some might say is why the Wikipedia article he was reading said that the angles involved in these calculations are very small and thus difficult to measure. Note the use of the word difficult as opposed to impossible, which is what JISM's limp-wristed appeal to his audience's incredulity is attempting to suggest. Whilst it is impossible with the naked eye, which perfectly explains Brahe's inability to achieve it, measuring such small angles is possible with precise and well-calibrated instruments, such as, say, telescopes.
Or do you believe what Brahe said, which was if there is any parallax showing, it's from operator error or equipment malfunction. There's no way you can measure that amount of change.
Well, it seems strange to me that Brahe would have said this, given that he calculated how far away a star would have to be if its parallax were just beyond the limits of the naked eye. Indeed, JISM showed us this with one of his earlier quote mines, so he has no excuse for fabricating statements. And I, for one, would love to see a fully referenced quotation of Tycho Brahe specifically saying that any parallax observed is due to operator error or equipment malfunction. Of course, I don't really expect him to furnish us with such a quotation, because the source is his tenuous grasp on reality. What JISM is implying here is that since 1838, when Bessel first achieved a measurement of stellar parallax, everyone has made the same mistakes over and over again, or everyone has used equipment with these same malfunctions, despite using different equipment manufactured in different locations in different ways at different times. They were all too stupid to notice, however. So how did JISM notice? Why doesn't he detail what these alleged errors and malfunctions actually are, and quantify their effect on what are entirely repeatable results? And why haven't Flat Earth dipshits designed and built their own accurate instruments and described precisely how to do so for the benefit of all humanity? Devoid of excuses, he tries to hedge his bets.
To be honest, this parallax was probably forged since the very beginning. In 1838, when they measured Cygni, it came back at 31 hundredths of an arcsecond, impossible for the 1800s.
Perhaps JISM should look up what honesty entails. For clarity, it doesn't entail pulling claims out of your arse and making spurious and unsubstantiated allegations, whilst claiming to be honest. Since JISM isn't familiar with the technology of 1838, he is in no position to declare it to be impossible, and unsurprisingly he makes no attempt to justify this statement. He also doesn't bother to explain why, even if such a measurement were impossible in 1838, that same measurement would have remained impossible ever since.
Forging, of course, for science is nothing new. A New York Times article, linked below, from 1990 talks about scholar and Dr. William H. Donahue, who proved that Kepler had fabricated his data.
What he fails to consider, primarily because he's a bumbling idiot, is that the scientific method wasn't established at that time, so standards were somewhat different to those expected today. It should be noted that JISM's own standards don't meet those expected in primary education, so having someone who provides no data, no substantiation, and who does no science criticising someone who did is more than a little rich. Whilst being very keen to name-drop Donahue and cherry-pick the article, JISM fails to mention that page 2 states that Dr. Donahue, like many other experts, feels the episode does little to diminish Kepler's reputation. He had a difficult job trying to convince people that the ellipse was correct, he said, so he fudged a little. This doesn't take him down a notch. It was a small point in the argument. And that conclusion is reasonable because of one simple fact. Kepler's laws worked when tested, and enabled predictions of planetary motion with far greater accuracy than before, which is why his forging of data is essentially irrelevant. It's also worth noting that Dr. Donahue's translation of Kepler's masterwork, with its deception on full display, is to be published this year, being 1990, by the Cambridge University Press, which is just the kind of outcome you'd expect of a global conspiracy of science to hide the truth from the unwashed masses.
And yes, there may be some stellar parallax. Astronomers have technically observed stars moving, and thousands of them.
So, in a video that is supposedly intended to present a global, centuries-long conspiracy to hide the fact that parallax doesn't happen, here we have an acknowledgement that it does.
Well, here's the point. About half of those show parallax. True. But half of each of the movements is in the opposite direction. That's called positive, negative parallax.
This is meaningless, since JISM doesn't define what he means by positive and negative parallax, and since these terms have no astronomical meaning, it's fair to conclude that he's just making shit up, or has been reading lunatic fringe websites. But let's see if he can turn this vomit of words into a coherent description of his thoughts.
If we go around the sun, parallax would be in one direction. Positive-negative parallax is not parallax. If we were truly going around the sun, it would be in one direction.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points.
Luckily, JISM is about to finally show us what he thinks parallax is, so get your face-protecting oven gloves ready.
Now take a look at this star chart here. In the planetarium software, you'll see I changed the location to California. I'm now moving the time, and you'll see how the stars in the north rotate around anti-clockwise, counterclockwise, as they should. Now you see me moving the day. In a second here, I will move the month. Now we're moving the month, and we see the stars moving the same direction. Now when we move the year, we should see the stellar parallax. Now when we move the year, we should see the stellar parallax. Now when we move the year, we should see the stellar parallax, correct?
Wrong.
Here is your stellar parallax. That's right, it is just the jostling of the sky.
Yes, having previously claimed that the very small angles of stellar parallax are impossible to measure, he is now claiming to be able to see stellar parallax by looking at a simulated image of the sky on his computer. Despite having failed miserably, JISM, like all conspirators, thinks he's not only understood everything perfectly, but that his understanding trumps the educated world, and that as a result he's exposed yet another global conspiracy. This is possible, of course, because the global elite are, yet again, so incompetent that their devilish schemes can be foiled simply by failing to grasp simple geometry and English comprehension when reading Wikipedia articles.
Hundreds of thousands of confirmed star movements refute and disprove stellar parallax.
No measurements refuting stellar parallax exist. In reality, we're dealing with an idiot who thinks that because the stars appear to go round Earth each day, everything you've learned about space is false and Earth is flat because reasons.
It's time to realize that this isn't a conspiracy anymore. You just need to do the research.
If you find Jism's output compelling, you're clearly not doing any research and are just assuming that he is. But what was his research in this video? Mining quotes from the internet, not researching their context or meaning, making up his own context, wildly speculating about murder, cherry-picking his way around inconvenient information, and asserting the existence of centuries-long conspiracies with zero substantiation, and failing spectacularly to understand even a simple concept like parallax, something that anyone can understand because it only requires basic trigonometry. Trigonometry that he will never do, because insert pathetic preemptive excuse here, like, say, this one.
Math is not reality.
It is, however, the only language capable of precisely and unequivocally describing and predicting reality. That capability and precision is why, whenever you ask one of these pestilential skid marks to present any mathematical description of their fantasy universe, they can't do it, and they have to reach for the nearest excuse in the hope that nobody will notice their transparent fecklessness. If you've been wondering just how stupid you have to be to think that global conspiracies can be blown wide open by looking no further than Wikipedia, check out Jeranism and the useless skid marks who think he's exposing the conspiracy. It's a world of batshit.
The movement we have seen in all stars since Bessel doesn't prove heliocentrism, it proves it absolutely false. Everything, and I mean everything that we were taught about space, about the planets, about the orbits is a hoax. It's a lie. So, any scientists, any physicists out there going to do anything? NASA, we're coming for you. For 60 years, you've been faking space. Earth doesn't move. Look around.